All right, this is the podcast about pitch tendencies and so forth that we've discussed in class, but I want to go over one more time again. There are some videos within this that I hope the sound turns out okay, that will answer some things maybe a little bit better than what I've been able to show you with the examples that they have. And then finally, you'll notice, even though this is assigned for both brass and woodwinds, this whole presentation has a little bit more of a slant towards brass instruments, simply because brass instruments, in terms of using the harmonic series, use on a more regular basis the full spectrum of the harmonic series for creation of different specific pitches and so forth. But nonetheless, the full spectrum is important for woodwinds in terms of intonation and the way they work in extended registers, and in terms of the timbral aspects of the instrument. So we'll go ahead and get started with this. A couple things to keep in mind as we go through this, that there's some ground rules for the discussion. This is the same as we talked in class, that for the purpose of what we're doing, disregard octave transpositions, disregard really truly any kind of transposition. We're just talking right now, and whatever we talk about in terms of specific pitch, just written pitch. The other thing is, even though if you talk to an acoustician, they would tell you these are three very different things, musicians in general, and I mean musicians as in 99.9% of musicians, tend to use these three terms interchangeably: harmonics, partials, and overtones. In truth, they are not the same thing, but for the sake of our casual discussions we have as musicians, they often are interpreted as the same thing. So I think that's a safe assumption to make, that you can generally go into a conversation about any of this and use them interchangeably, and you'll be understood. The next thing, as it says, there are different ways of naming and numbering harmonics, and this can cause confusion. Okay, some musicians do not consider the fundamental to be a harmonic. It's just the fundamental. In that case, the string halves will give the first harmonic, the string thirds will give the second harmonic, and so on. When the fundamental is included in calculations, it is called the first partial, and the rest of the harmonics are the second, third, fourth partials, and so on. So this is the clinical, real explanation of how to use these terms. But again, we're not following this. Also, some musicians use the term overtones as a synonym for harmonics. For others, however, an overtone is any frequency, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a harmonic, that can be heard resonating with the fundamental. For instance, a really good example, the sound of a gong or a tam-tam or cymbals will include overtones that aren't harmonics within the harmonic spectrum that we think of. That's why the gong sound doesn't seem to have as definite of a pitch as a vibrating string does. If you're uncertain what someone means by the second harmonic or by the term overtones, ask for clarification. And again, for the sake of our discussion here, we're going to use overtones, partials, harmonics as interchangeable terms. Okay, here's a little form on looking at what the harmonics in nature resemble. Notice the second harmonic is half the wavelength and twice the frequency of the first. In other words, if you look at from one node to the next, there are twice as many, and it's half the thing. The third harmonic has a third the wavelength, fourth harmonic has a fourth, fifth has a fifth, sixth has a sixth. Notice the sixth, though, is double the third. Notice the fourth is double the second, 4 times the first. So it's all harmonic relationships within those fractions. The actual harmonic series written over 16 harmonics, as we've discussed in class, and we've really only been concerned with the first 8 harmonics. And notice this is based on the pitch C. You have your octave, and then we have a fifth, then a fourth, and then if you look at that fourth C, so we've already had 3 C's, notice you have a major triad. The fourth, fifth, sixth harmonic, C, E, G. If you consider the seventh with that, you have a dominant seventh chord, C, E, G, B flat. And then the 8th harmonic is C again. Notice the first harmonic, second harmonic, fourth harmonic, 8th harmonic, and 16th harmonic are all the same pitch name because you're having the vibration from each one of them, and so the number doubles. Notice please, the third harmonic, which is G, is the same pitch name as the sixth harmonic. G is the same pitch name as the 12th harmonic, G, and so forth. You could even go to the point, look at the seventh harmonic, which if we base it on the pitch of C is B flat, the 14th harmonic is also B flat. When we get into prime numbers, the math doesn't work out quite so easily as in with 11. Okay, so if we went to the 22nd harmonic, though, it would also be an F sharp. All right. You will notice too that once we look at the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th harmonic, we're getting very close to a full diatonic scale pattern, but we're not quite there yet. We're not quite there yet within that. This is what we talked about Monday that I tried to get across, these two different things: equal temperament versus pure or just intonation. Again, equal temperament has to be incorporated to be able to play equally out of tune in any of our traditional keys on a fixed pitch instrument. Fixed pitched instruments, again, are keyboard instruments, be they electronic, be they acoustic, be they percussion instruments, and so forth. All they have to be fixed. Pure just intonation instruments are those that have the ability, and in somewhat in their design, are based off they have the ability to adjust pitch to fit what we want to hear in the natural harmonic series. Here's the math, and this may blow your mind a little bit, but if you look at the intervals between and the math behind the intervals between pitches and intervals, if you will, the interval between pitches, excuse me, you'll notice that a unison and an octave were in agreement. If you look at the perfect fifth, you can see that the numbers 1.4983 and 1.5 are remarkably close. We're 17 ten-thousandths apart is all on those two. You'll also notice a perfect fourth is even closer than that. It's 15th ten-thousandths apart. But then you get into some of these intervals, you can see there's a pretty big discrepancy, and that's where the difference really hits us between pure and equal temperament. Again, equal temperament is a formula, and you can see how that formula is derived at using the 12th root of the number and then multiplied out within that to get the percentage. It's basically so you have a formula, so it's equal steps between each pitch, and then the natural harmonic series is all based on gradually building fractions between 1/1 up to 2/1, and you can follow that progression there. But those intervals between those fractions are not equal, and that leaves us, you can notice the approximate difference there in the middle as to which ones are relatively close and which ones are quite a distance away. Okay, what does that mean for us? Okay, if we're looking at the blue harmonic series, and we're in most situations as wind players, vocalists, string players, we are trying to eliminate beats. In those wavelengths we looked at, we're looking for lack of collision. In the equal temperament, we're forfeiting that option to allowing there always being some minor beats present, and our ears over time have just gotten used to it. And no matter what key we're playing in, what circumstances, it's equally out of tune. Okay, and again, other than when we get into electronic instruments and organ, the sustain on most of those fixed pitched instruments is not as great as on a wind instrument, so it becomes even less discernible within those. But for the wind player making the change from playing in a just intonation system to, say, being accompanied, as we talked about in class, there is an adjustment that has to happen. Vocalists, it's a less noticeable adjustment because they automatically listen and adjust, so they never have this conversation, or to my best of my route, my knowledge, they don't have this conversation. You can study that on your own. Cumulative pitch error. Again, we talked about this, and this only comes into play on brass instruments, and that is primarily on the 3-valve instruments, and how the combinations of the valves don't quite work out to create the correct length to serve all its purposes. The valves have to serve multiple purposes, so they're designed with compromise in mind. And the way we get around cumulative pitch error, and the biggest one, is when we use 1 and 3 on 3-valve instruments in combination, and 1, 2, and 3, which is also a 1 and 3 in combination. We have to boost the length of the tube a little bit. It's for some sort of compensation of a tuning slide. On trumpet, that's in cornet, that's easy. Flugelhorn, etc., any of those essentially same octave instruments. We have kick slides and thumb slides and things on larger instruments. That's why we've had the advent of the 4th valve involved. It's just a complete substitute fingering for the 1 and 3 that can be designed longer. Okay, and we won't go into the math again on this in this presentation, but that's that whole idea that the distance between pitches in terms of the pipe length increases by a equal percentage, not an equal distance, an equal percentage. And so there's the gap, the interval between and on the pipe needs to get incrementally longer, and the combinations don't add up. Well, what does this mean to you? Okay, basically you've got to be aware of this stuff. It is going to confront. One thing to consider, though, within all this as we talk about intonation, is students or players or adults, doesn't matter what age they are not making characteristics, predictably centered sounds. Any discussion about intonation is going to be a little bit on the futile side. From with beginners, very futile, to with advanced players, maybe somewhat unpredictable. It'll be okay 1 minute, and then as outside factors come in, like endurance and such come in, it'll be off again. So your awareness of what the factors might be based on the design of the instruments and the way just our harmonic universe works will help make you better informed judgments. Other factors that can affect pitch, keep in mind. Tube length, obviously. On most all instruments, even woodwind instruments, we vary the length of the tube by adding fingers, closing leaks in a pipe, or opening leaks in a pipe. Temperature, again, as air temperature rises, resistance in the tube is lessened, meaning the pitch goes up. As air temperature within the tube it lowers, there's much more resistance in the molecules, the airstream slows down, pitch goes down. Cold equals flat, hot equals sharp. Air speed, well, sometimes beyond temperature affecting airspeed, actual airspeed of the person playing the instrument can affect it. On all but the single reed instruments, it follows that same formula. If the airspeed is fast, pitch goes up. If the airspeed is slow, pitch goes down. However, single reed instruments, particularly the smaller single reed instruments, the small clarinet family instruments, and alto saxophone, it works in opposite. As you slow the air column down, less supported, the pitch goes up. Embouchure tension, obviously, gripping in any way, boosting the object that is creating the tension of the initial vibration to create the vibration higher is going to raise. Too loose of an embouchure is going to low. Generally, embouchure tension goes hand in hand with what's going on with the airspeed too. The oral cavity. Very often instruments, and it varies from instrument to instrument, the openness or closedness, the placement of the palate can have a lot of effect on pitch, but more so that it would even have a greater effect on timbre. You have to remember, on most instruments, the oral cavity, to a little extreme or to a great extreme, like with flute and bassoon and oboe, becomes actually part of the resonance. And having that wide open oral cavity on double reed instruments and flute really adds to the capabilities of resonance for that instrument in particular. Tube obstructions. This is one we don't always think about. Generally happens in brass instruments more than woodwind instruments, though it can happen in a bassoon or a saxophone down around a curved area. If you have obstructions in the tube, say a pencil gets stuck in the lead pipe of a trombone or a trumpet or something, it is going to affect pitch. So if you really find somebody with an instrument that you don't seem to be able, they seem to be doing everything properly and they can't really lock in pitch very consistently, or it's way off, you find yourself adjusting their tuning adjustment, tuning slides, that kind of thing, extreme, might be worth taking a second, popping a couple slides off, looking down the tubes, and seeing what you would need to do to clean that out, and you might notice an extreme difference. And those things happen, especially in the bigger instruments. We talked in brass class about what you just might find down a tuba or a sousaphone. You don't want to know. Okay, let's move on. Brass instruments in the harmonic series. Here's a nice little video for you.
I'm standing in the factory where Besson brass musical instruments are built. Since the 19th century, Besson's has been associated with the technology and manufacture of brass instruments. It's an appropriate place to start this film, which is about the technology of brass instruments. There are three broad themes that I want to explore. Firstly, the basic acoustical principles of brass instruments. Secondly, the way in which technical developments have affected brass instruments, and thirdly, the relationship between those developments and performers. Indeed, in the final sequence of the film, we will be looking at ways in which the latest scientific research is casting new light on that complex relationship.
One feature which links all brass instruments, oddly enough, is not the material they're made of. It doesn't matter whether they're made of brass or not, but it's the fact that the sound is generated by getting the player to buzz their lips. And it's the opening and closing of the lips which generates the sound. That's the characteristic of all brass instruments.
The three instruments we see in front of us, a conch shell, an animal horn, and a natural brass trumpet, are all made so the player can place the lips comfortably against it and blow through the tube, vibrating the lips. The conch shell is a naturally constructed tube wrapped round and round with a large opening. The player can place the lips against the small end of the conch shell, which has been cut off at that point. The animal horn similarly has been hollowed out and has a termination which is fairly comfortable for the player to place the lips against. But like the conch shell, it only plays one good note. So these simple instruments have tended to remain as signalling and ceremonial instruments.
I suppose the first crucial thing was the development of wood and metalworking technology, which actually allowed people to manufacture tubes of pre-designed form rather than just accepting something which already existed. So wooden trumpets, metal trumpets, which go way back, of course, to the time of the ancient Egyptians, that was the first stage in controlling the shape of the air column that you were going to use as your resonator.
The elements of the natural trumpet, which turn it from a signalling instrument into a truly musical instrument, are first of all the mouthpiece, and at the other end the bell flare, which is critical for the reflection of the sound waves inside the instrument.
The mouthpiece serves two functions. One is to allow the lips to be pressed against it, and the other is to modify the timbre of the sound. And when the player buzzes the lips in the mouthpiece, the pulses of air which are sent through the lips by the lips opening and closing set up standing wave vibrations in the air column, and that's what generates the sound.
And does all of the air come out carrying musical notes with it?
It's an interesting question. In actual fact, almost all of the sound energy that the player sends from the lips down through the tubing is reflected when it gets to the bell. That's quite hard for people to appreciate because the bell is open and it doesn't seem obvious why the sound shouldn't just simply radiate out through it. But in actual fact, more than 90% of the sound energy is reflected back, and only a small fraction radiates as sound.
How does a player change the pitch of the note that emanates from a brass instrument?
There are two things which basically determine the pitch of the note. The vibration frequency of the lips, which is of course under the player's control directly, and the resonances of the air column in the instrument. So if a player wants to change the note, there are two ways that it can be done. First of all, you can alter the resonance frequency of your lips just by tightening them or altering the amount of tissue that you're putting into the mouthpiece. That's what the player controls, setting the embouchure. And by adjustment of the embouchure, you can change the basic buzzing frequency of the lips. But when you have the lips coupled through a mouthpiece to a piece of tubing, then the tubing itself has its own resonance frequencies. There are certain natural pitches that the tubing of a trumpet, for example, likes to play. And so the player has to interact with that preference of the instrument and choose a lip frequency which matches closely one of the resonances of the tube. So if you want to play, say, the lowest normal note on the natural trumpet, you choose a low lip frequency and you excite that note in the trumpet tube. If you want to play the next one, you make your lips buzz at a higher frequency, and the note that comes out of the instrument is the second resonance, and so on.
And that's the harmonic series.
Yes. The natural trumpets, for example, in the Renaissance, could only play notes from the second harmonic upwards. It's an interesting fact that the first harmonic of the natural trumpets wasn't in tune. It wasn't a real first harmonic. It was too flat, just because of technical complications in the making of the tubes, so that it wasn't possible to use that harmonic. But from the second harmonic up as far as the 24th harmonic, players developed specialized techniques for being able to play these notes. The ones who played right up in the very high harmonics were the clarino players, and that was a very specialized branch of trumpet playing.
How much of the sound is down to the player, and how much of it is down to the instrument that he or she is blowing through?
The fact that the sound is basically generated by the lips of the player, and that's where it all starts, is the really crucial thing here, I think, because the player's lips, in my view, play a much more important role in the cooperation with the instrument than, say, the reed of an oboe does in the cooperation with the air column of the oboe. The player can really control and change the sound very much just by what the player does with the lips. And in fact, some players can make almost any kind of instrument sound with their characteristic sound, however good or bad the instrument is. However, it's obvious that a really good player is trying to constantly push the bounds of possibilities on the instrument and develop new techniques and so on. And for that purpose, a really good player needs a really good instrument.
If I was a very rich man and I could give you lots of money to go out and buy a brand new instrument, let's say a B-flat trumpet, what would you do to test whether that instrument is the instrument that you would be buying? What is it that you look for in a good instrument?
There are two things that I think are most important when we're choosing an instrument. Intonation is the tuning of the notes of the harmonic series. and the second is the response. It's basically how sensitive that instrument is to the way that I'm playing. So if I aim for a particular note, I feel that the note is speaking easily with the least amount of effort.
What is it that affects the timbre of an instrument, apart from any qualities an individual player has? Why is it that two instruments of the same pitch sound different?
When you buzz your lips into a mouthpiece, you're generating quite a complex disturbance of the air in the mouthpiece. It's a periodic vibration, a periodic variation of the air pressure, which is rising and falling regularly. But it's not a simple sinusoidal variation. It's got quite a lot of harmonics in it. And so each of these harmonics is sent down the tube and has the possibility of interacting with a resonance of the air column. In a well-designed brass instrument, these resonances are members of a harmonic series. And so each of the harmonics you send in from the lips can find a partner in the air column and sort of interact with that and build up a strong, rich standing wave. But if the instrument is not very well designed, some of these might be out of tune, and then the interaction will not be as successful, the sound will not be as rich. However, the shape of the air column also affects the strength of the resonances. And so, for example, in a widely flaring tube, the lower resonances are particularly strong, and therefore the lower frequency harmonics you put in from the lips are preferentially amplified and give a very mellow sound. On a tubing which is much more narrow for a lot of its length, like the traditional natural trumpet, for example, which is cylindrical over more than half the length, the upper harmonics are relatively strong and the lower harmonics are relatively weak. And that means that the sound is much more brilliant, but lacking in some of the mellowness you get from the wider flaring tubes.
There's an interesting question about whether or not the materials that a brass instrument is made of actually matter.
For many years, scientists have been trying to find out whether the materials of the walls of the instrument affect the sound. And many interesting experiments have been done. And what these have shown is that there is a small measurable interaction between the pressure variations in the air column inside the instrument and the vibrations of the walls. But the amount of sound energy which is radiated by the walls is very tiny in comparison to the sound which comes out through the end of the instrument, through the bell. And as a result, it's very dubious whether that tiny amount of extra sound energy is actually audible by a listener. So many tests have been done to try to establish this, and the scientific jury is still out on that question.
Why brass instruments then? Because brass has been used for centuries as the basic material.
The fact that brass instruments are made of brass, I think, is down to several very straightforward reasons. One is it's an easily available material, it's cheap, and it's malleable. It's easy to push it into the rather complicated flaring shapes that you need for a well-designed brass instrument. But instruments have been made from other materials, of course, from copper, from silver, and players often think that a different material, such as silver or copper, makes a big difference to the sound. But scientific tests have been struggling to actually demonstrate a measurable difference.
How do players control whether a music they're playing is loud or quiet?
This is an interesting question that we've been investigating with some of our experiments with artificial lips. And what we have found is, of course, what players know, that the basic control you have is the pressure that you exert, the pressure which comes from the lungs and is in the mouth. If you start by blowing very, very gently with your lips in a fixed position, at first you don't make a sound. You only hear gentle hissing sound as the air goes between your lips. But then, at a certain critical pressure threshold, the lips spontaneously start to vibrate, opening and closing and generating a quiet sound in the instrument. And then, as you increase the pressure, the amplitude of the opening and closing of the lips gets bigger and bigger, and the amplitude of the sound gets louder and louder. The main reason why I'm doing research into brass instruments is that I'm both an acoustician and a brass instrument player, and therefore my innate scientific curiosity about the things that I do led me into research in brass instruments. But there's a more general point, which is that the interaction between the lips of a brass player and the instrument is a very interesting interaction from the scientific as well as the musical point of view. It falls into a class of scientific studies which we describe technically as nonlinear dynamics, and that's an area in which there's a lot of current research interest. The way in which the player can control the sound of a brass instrument with the lips is fascinatingly complex and not scientifically understood fully.
Well, there you have it. Maybe some new concepts for some of you, but probably just adds to the confusion on the whole thing. Again, most of the objective in this is just to make you aware and raise your awareness. So that concludes this. Thank you very much.